Hey guys, welcome to Rosie's Dessert Spot. In this tutorial, I'll be demonstrating how to create this super tall watercolor and gold leaf communion cake. I created this for my little cousin who had her communion recently, and I've used butterscotch mud cake. This is just Bakels white chocolate mud with some butterscotch flavoring added to it. Because it's going to be covered in fondant, I'm creating a dam in ganache, so just a ring around the edge, filling in with butterscotch frosting, and then halfway up the cake that I'm building, I'm going to add in some support. These are bubble tea straws cut flush with the top of the cake, and a cake board is going to be in between the cake. Stick with some frosting and keep building your cake. So there's 3 layers at the top, 3 layers at the bottom. I'm going to create my crumb coat with some of that ganache. I've actually added a little bit of buttercream into my ganache. It doesn't really matter how much you add, more so for taste. But it's just a lot firmer when you're adding fondant and it gives you a cleaner effect. Scrape down the excess, clean up your top edge and pop it into the fridge to set for at least 20 minutes. Because it's covered in fondant, like I mentioned before, I'm going to be coating the whole thing in that chocolate buttercream frosting. You can use crusting buttercream, which is all butter based buttercream, but ganache just does a much better job. Fill in any spaces when you're creating your final layer of frosting. I like to run my scraper against the cake board to clean up the bottom edge. I'm going to leave that top edge raised and then pop it into the fridge overnight. And what I'm going to do is use a very hot blade and I'm going to cut off the excess. I noticed that this gives me the best super sharp edges possible, even more so than when you're using a spatula to bring in that lip. Once you've cut off the edge, you can go across with a nice hot spatula just to make sure that it's all even. To make sure that the fondant sticks to my cake, I'm going over it with a very, very thin film of vegetable shortening. You can't taste it. Some people prefer to use water instead, so you can spray water on there instead to make it a bit tacky so the fondant can stick to something. And then let that sit while you roll out your fondant. I'm using cornstarch. You could also use icing sugar as a non-stick agent. Alternatively, if it's really cold where you are, you could also use vegetable shortening as well, and that'll just give it a little bit more flexibility. Wrap it over the cake, push out any trapped air, and seal in that very top edge. You want to do this, super important, especially with tall cakes, because the fondant's going to weigh, and that's the first place it's going to rip. You want to make sure to work very quickly so your fondant doesn't have a chance to rip or have the elephant skin. You could knead in some vegetable shortening into your fondant to help it become more flexible and reduce the risk of elephant skin. Cut off the excess, make sure you knead it into a ball and wrap it in Glad wrap so it doesn't dry up, and then go over your cake with fondant smoothers. I like to work on the very top edge before I do anything else, so it's nice and flexible still and you get that nice sharp edge. And then go over the rest of the cake to smooth it all out. I've got a large blush brush and I'm dipping it in some edible paint. You could use some gel food color mixed through with vodka or vinegar if you can't use alcohol. And I'm tapping it just 1/5 of the way down and making it nice and jagged and random. Once that's been covered, go in with a little bit more gel color into the mix with the alcohol so it's a bit darker and create a bit of a watercolor effect. I thought it wasn't quite long enough, so I just kept adding and reaching down further. To create the name in the fondant, I'm using a letter embossing set by Sweet Stamp, and I'm using the very middle letter to begin with, so I know exactly where the center will be. Make sure to press nice and firmly and wriggle your finger around so the whole area of the letter gets indented. Now that we have a decent guide, I'm taking some luster dust with vodka to create a gold paint. You could use edible gold paint as well. I just like to make it myself. Use a nice thin brush for best control. And don't stress if you get any off of the letter. You can go in with a clean brush and a little bit of alcohol again and just clean up that section. For a last touch, I'm adding on some gold leaf. I like to peel back the paper and then just stick the gold leaf directly on there. My paint is still a little bit moist, it hasn't dried completely, which is why it's sticking so beautifully. If it's not sticking, you can zap your cake with a little bit of steam from a handheld steamer, just to make it tacky. The very front, I'm adding in a laser cut gold cross, just with a little bit of buttercream frosting behind it to stick. I've got some white flowers, they have been washed. If you could use organic ones, it'd be even better. And then pop them onto your cake with a little bit of buttercream. The very center ones don't have buttercream on them, they're just being filled in. If it makes you more comfortable, you could have baking paper underneath this instead, and just stick the baking paper on the cake with frosting. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and you give it a go, and if you do, hashtag Rosie's Dessert Spot so I can see your awesome creations as well. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll catch you all next time.